The wind howled across the tarmac, its sharp gusts carrying the chill of the coming storm. The base, nestled in the mountains, stood still under the thickening clouds. It was early morning, just before the first light of day broke through the gray sky, casting long shadows on the empty airstrip. The usually bustling hub of activity felt strangely quiet, almost abandoned. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the soft clatter of tools inside the hangar. Sarah Reyes moved through this quiet, unnoticed by most of the personnel around her. She was a technician, tasked with ensuring the readiness of the base's helicopters and aircraft. Unlike the pilots who drew attention with their flight suits and rank, she wore the plain, olive-drab uniform of a support crew member. There were no wings sewn above her chest, no visible insignia of rank beyond her name tag Reyes. She didn't need them. In a way, it seemed like she was invisible to the others. Her steps were deliberate, and her eyes were always focused on the task at hand. Today, like every other, she checked the tail number of one of the helicopters parked near the hangar, double-checking the sensor readout and making adjustments to the calibration. There was no room for mistakes. Her attention to detail ensured that the birds returned to the skies after every mission. But even with her precision, no one paid her much mind. A young lieutenant near the tool bench glanced at her with a smirk, tossing a wrench into a metal tray. "Hey, Reyes," he called out. "Ever think about flying one of these for real?" He chuckled, and a few others joined in. She didn't respond, her hands still working with a smoothness that had become second nature to her. "Just making sure you don't fall out of the sky." She muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible. The joke wasn't new, but it still stung. She was good at her job. Really good. But no one ever acknowledged it. And even if they did, it was always just in passing. She had never been a part of the conversation when it came to missions or accolades. She was the one who worked late into the night, fixing the broken parts that others would never notice until they malfunctioned. The whispers about her past, about why she was here never fully formed into words. Some said she had been reassigned after a mission gone wrong. Others said she had been overlooked for promotion. None of that mattered. Inside the operations room, the morning briefing was wrapping up, and a storm was brewing. The clouds had thickened, and the cold air carried the scent of rain. Flights were going to be limited for the next 48 hours. Non-essential flights would be grounded, and medevac operations would need regional approval. The commander's voice echoed in the room, calmly announcing the grounded status of every flight. No one questioned the decision. Sarah signed off on the maintenance forms, her movements mechanical, and walked to the back office to file the records. The room was quiet, filled with archive boxes and files, the kind of place where things were stored but never remembered. Her fingers brushed over the cracked photograph hanging on the wall. It showed a group of pilots in front of a Black Hawk, their faces bright, squinting into the sun. At the corner of the photo, almost cropped out, was her silhouette. She was younger in the picture, but her eyes were the same unreadable, distant. She stared at it for a moment longer than she intended, but then forced herself to look away. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver down her spine. A siren wailed briefly in the distance, a routine weather alert. She didn't flinch. Reyes walked back toward the hangar, her boots soft against the cold concrete. As she passed by two young mechanics, they stepped aside without a word. She overheard one of them murmur something about ghosts walking in daylight. She didn't react. In the mess hall later, Sarah sat alone, as she often did. The television played a constant loop of weather reports. The storm was growing, its grip tightening on the eastern peaks. Outside, the wind began to howl, and snowflakes danced in the air, preparing for the worst. She picked at her meal without much thought, the silence around her louder than any conversation. A medic walked by, offering a small nod. She returned it with a faint smile. "Used to fly, right?" the medic asked casually. She paused, not sure how to respond. "Used to," she replied quietly, her fork hovering in the air. The medic hesitated, then moved on without pressing further. When she finished her lunch, she returned to the hangar, her home away from home. There was always something to fix, something to adjust, something to check. The hum of the machines, the quiet of the hangar, these were the things she knew best. They never judged her. They never asked why she was here or why she kept to herself. The hum of the helicopter engines was all she needed to hear. And so, she worked, alone in the quiet, waiting for something to change, but knowing that it probably wouldn't. The crackling voice came through the comm system, cutting through the quiet hum of the operations room. "Mayday, Mayday, Blackbird 2, we are going down. Grid 9. Echo, rotor failure, 3 injured on board, 1 critical. Requesting immediate assistance." The urgency in the voice was clear, a mix of panic and desperation. The room fell silent, eyes darting to the screen as the coordinates of the downed aircraft appeared. Everyone instinctively turned to the commander for direction. The storm outside was growing worse by the minute. The sky had darkened, and the winds were picking up speed, howling like a wild beast. Outside, the visibility was nearly zero, with sheets of rain and snow blurring everything in sight. Despite the urgency of the situation, the decision came quickly, almost automatically. The commander's voice was calm, measured. "We can't risk sending anyone out in this weather. We'll wait for the storm to pass. No one leaves the base until the weather clears." Sarah's eyes locked on the screen as she listened to the ongoing exchange between the operations officer and the Blackbird 2 crew. The static-filled voice crackled through again. "Negative. We have no cover, no backup. Weather's worsening. Need evacuation. Medical urgent." She stood off to the side, watching as the others huddled around the terminal, discussing the situation in cold, clinical tones. She saw the pattern repeating itself. The storm, the indecision, the paperwork, the rules. Lives were bleeding out behind these walls of policy, and no one was doing anything about it. She could feel the weight of the silence in the room, thick with resignation. Her pulse quickened, her eyes never leaving the screen. The decision had already been made. Everyone had already turned their backs. But Sarah knew what had to be done. She couldn't just stand by and watch. The room was full of trained professionals, each one a capable pilot in their own right. Yet none of them moved. No one even offered to challenge the commander's orders. The storm was too dangerous, the risks too high. But there was something in Sarah that refused to accept inaction. She took a slow breath, her gaze shifting toward the hangar where the helicopters were parked. She knew what had to happen. Without thinking about it too much, she stepped forward, breaking the silence. "I'll take it," she said, her voice firm. The room seemed to freeze for a moment. The commander turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "You're not cleared for flight status, Reyes," he said, his voice low and cautious. "You've been off flight status for over 2 years. We can't just throw you into this." Sarah didn't back down. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither is anyone else," she replied, her tone steady. She knew it wasn't her place to challenge orders, but the thought of those men out there, stranded, was unbearable. Her fingers brushed the edge of her jacket, and she pulled out a small, worn key on a chain. She held it up for all to see. "This key starts Eagle 2. I've run diagnostics on every bird in this hangar. I know that route, and I've flown that bird before. I'm taking it." There was a murmur from the room, some questioning, others uncertain. One of the younger officers took a step back, his face pale. "She was on the Santoro mission," he whispered, the weight of those words falling heavy in the room. The commander stiffened but didn't respond immediately. "You're not authorized, Reyes," the commander repeated, but there was doubt in his voice now. He could see the determination in her eyes. He could see that she wasn't backing down. "Give me 30 minutes, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Without waiting for another response, she turned and made her way toward the hangar. The sound of her boots echoed in the silent room, as if signaling the beginning of something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The operations team scrambled into action, some gathering data, others preparing the helicopter. Mechanics were already moving toward Eagle 2, pulling out tools and making quick adjustments. Sarah didn't wait for them to finish. She didn't need their approval. She knew what needed to be done, and she was going to do it herself. As she approached the helicopter, her hand hovered over the controls, and she took a slow, steady breath. The door opened, and she climbed inside. The cockpit smelled of oil and leather, familiar in a way that grounded her. She was home. The engine roared to life as she began flipping switches, preparing for takeoff. The familiar hum of the rotors filled her ears, and a sense of calm settled over her. She'd flown this exact bird countless times, long before she had been grounded. The controls were second nature to her, a muscle memory she couldn't shake even if she wanted to. The storm greeted her like an old adversary, its gusts pushing against the rotors as she guided the helicopter into the air. The world below was swallowed by the low cloud cover, and the cold, harsh wind stung her face. Sarah focused, her hands steady on the controls. As she ascended, she glanced at the radar, checking the location of Blackbird 2. The coordinates matched the position she had seen earlier. She had only one chance to reach them if she didn't make it. No one would. The cockpit buzzed with static as she received updates from the command. "Center, Eagle 2 be advised, weather conditions are worsening. Low visibility expected," came the voice. She acknowledged the transmission with a simple nod. The weather was going to test her, but she was ready. This wasn't her first time flying through a storm like this. She had trained for this. She had lived for this. She wasn't going to fail. She adjusted the throttle, carefully navigating through the turbulence, feeling every shift in the aircraft. The mountain ridges loomed ahead, their jagged edges visible even through the haze. Sarah didn't fight the wind. She let it guide her, adjusting for every gust before it even hit. The Blackbird 2's wreckage finally appeared through the mist dark shapes. Against the snow-covered cliffs, it was a narrow spot, not a true landing zone, just a small outcrop of rock barely wide enough for the helicopter. She lowered the aircraft carefully, controlling the descent with pinpoint accuracy. The landing was rough, but she made it. Her heart was racing as she checked the status of the soldiers waiting for her. One of them was standing with a flare, waving it frantically. The others were injured but alive. She didn't hesitate. She opened the door, shouting above the wind for them to climb in. The first 2 soldiers scrambled into the cabin, their faces pale but grateful. The third was unconscious, blood staining his uniform. Sarah quickly strapped him into the seat and slammed the door shut. "Hang on," she called out to the soldiers. "We're getting out of here." As she lifted the helicopter back into the sky, the storm continued to rage. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had a job to do, and she was going to see it through. Sarah's hands gripped the controls of Eagle 2, her focus unshakable as the helicopter roared through the thickening storm. The cockpit was a blur of flashing indicators and warning lights. The wind battered the aircraft, pushing it to the side. But she corrected with swift, practiced movements. Her eyes flicked between the radar and the dark clouds, calculating her next move with each turn of the rotor blades. The storm had descended quickly, enveloping the mountains in a swirling vortex of snow and ice. Visibility was down to near zero, and the sky had become a mass of angry gray. She could feel the bite of the cold through the thin layer of her flight suit. But she didn't have time to worry about that. The Blackbird 2 crew was waiting, and every second counted. Her breathing remained steady, calm in the chaos. Years of training had prepared her for this moment, though nothing had quite prepared her for the weight of this mission. The Blackbird 2's transmission echoed through the comms again, distorted by static. "Eagle 2, we are holding position at Grid 9 Echo. Visibility is minimal. We're running low on fuel. Please hurry." The desperation was clear, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had to stay in control. Her eyes scanned the mountains below, trying to pick out any sign of the wreckage. She knew the terrain better than most, had flown these mountains in perfect weather. But this storm was a new challenge. The ridges were jagged, the cliffs steep and unforgiving. Each pass had to be calculated, each maneuver executed with precision. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Eagle 2, be advised." The voice crackled through the radio again. "You are nearing the impact zone. We have no visual confirmation of Blackbird 2's location. Exercise extreme caution." Sarah didn't respond. She was already focused on the task at hand. She adjusted the throttle, shifting the weight of the helicopter as it dipped and swayed with each gust of wind. The storm was relentless, but Sarah felt a calmness wash over her. She had done this before. She'd flown in worse conditions, and she knew how to handle Eagle 2. The aircraft shuddered as the wind whipped it violently, but she kept her grip firm. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted the first sign of the wreckage, a flash of light from a flare, struggling to pierce the dense snowstorm. It was far off, but visible enough for Sarah to track. She adjusted the heading, banking hard to the left. The rotor blades screamed as the helicopter cut through the heavy wind, pushing toward the flare. "Hold on," Sarah muttered to herself, focusing on the sight of the downed helicopter. Her training kicked in as she calculated the angle of descent. Every move needed to be perfect, no room for error. She had to get close, but not too close, because the debris and wreckage would make landing impossible. The ground was uneven, the area cluttered with rocks and snowdrifts. The flare grew larger, and she could see the shadow of Blackbird 2 through the storm. The tail rotor was sheared off, and the fuselage was tilted awkwardly against the mountain's face. Smoke trailed from a fire that had been half doused by the snow. The soldiers were still visible, huddled near the wreckage, their figures barely discernible through the swirling snow. Sarah knew she had only one shot at this. The wind was howling now, pushing her craft sideways, but she fought against it, pulling back on the cyclic to maintain altitude. She approached the wreckage slowly, maneuvering the helicopter with precision. The landing zone was tight, no more than a small outcrop of rock, barely wide enough for the helicopter's landing skids. The storm was pushing harder now, and she could feel the rotor blades straining with each gust of wind. Just a little further. Sarah whispered to herself as she brought the aircraft closer. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of what was at stake. Every muscle in her body was alert, every instinct sharpened. She adjusted her heading one more time, and with a controlled descent, she brought the helicopter down onto the narrow ledge. The landing was rougher than she had hoped. The skids scraped against the rocks, and the helicopter bounced slightly as it settled. The wind screamed around her, threatening to knock the aircraft over, but Sarah held it steady. She checked her instruments once more. Everything was green, but her heart was pounding in her chest. This wasn't over yet. The door slid open, and she leaned out into the biting wind, scanning the wreckage. One of the soldiers was waving a flare in tight circles, the light barely cutting through the thick, swirling snow. She motioned for them to hurry, and two of the soldiers stumbled toward her, their faces pale but filled with hope. They helped the other soldier into the cabin, his body limp, blood soaking through his uniform. He was barely conscious, but Sarah didn't waste time checking him. She slammed the door shut and fired up the rotors again. "Tell command you're secured. Strap in tight," Sarah shouted over the noise of the storm, her voice cutting through the chaos. The soldiers nodded, their eyes wide with fear and relief, but Sarah didn't wait for them to speak. She was already lifting the helicopter back into the air. The weight of the wounded soldiers made the helicopter sluggish, but Sarah adjusted, pulling back on the collective to compensate for the added load. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it seemed to grow more violent, the wind whipping the aircraft from side to side. Her hands were steady as she guided Eagle 2 back into the thick cloud cover. The terrain below was a blur, nothing but snow-covered ridges and cliffs. She had to navigate through the narrow passes, carefully avoiding the rising winds that could easily send her into a spin. The rotor system hummed as it struggled to maintain lift, but Sarah's grip on the controls never faltered. She had flown in these conditions before. She knew how to read the mountain. She knew the danger, and she knew how to survive it. As they neared the base, the comms crackled with updates, but Sarah barely listened. The storm had eaten up any remaining time, and the landing would be tricky. The soldiers in the back remained silent, the weight of their survival hanging in the air. The helicopter's instruments began to alert her to rotor strain ice, accumulation building up, but she kept her focus. Adjusting the pitch of the rotor blades slightly, she powered through, taking the safest route she knew. The base came into view as the storm raged on, the landing pad illuminated by lights flashing in the darkness. It was still a few minutes out, but she had made it this far. Sarah wasn't going to let the storm take this victory from her. She was going to finish this, no matter what. Clearing the ridge, she muttered, her voice low. The landing would be tough, but she was prepared for it. She had already made it through worse. The helicopter's wheels finally touched down, the landing pads bouncing slightly before the aircraft settled. The wind threw a final gust against the aircraft, but Sarah didn't flinch. The medics were already running toward the helicopter as the rotors slowed, and the door opened. The soldiers were quickly transferred to stretchers, and the helicopter was secured. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The mission wasn't over yet, but the hardest part was done. The storm had passed, but the weight of the mission still hung in the air as Sarah touched down back. At the base, the helicopter's rotors slowed, the screech of the blades cutting through the cold silence. As the door opened, the medics rushed in, their movements quick and efficient. The three soldiers were carefully transferred from the helicopter, their faces pale but alive. It wasn't a scene of victory, no applause or cheers, just the quiet hum of military routine taking over. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit and stepped onto the cold tarmac. Her flight suit was soaked, her face wind-burned and streaked with snow, but she didn't notice. Her eyes scanned the area, but there was no fanfare, no official ceremony to greet her return. The storm outside had cleared, but a new kind of silence filled the base, a silence that was more reflective than anything else. She walked toward the operations room, her steps deliberate and steady. As she passed the hangar, a few of the mechanics nodded. Some of the pilots stepped aside to give her space, their eyes lingering on her, no longer filled with dismissal but with something else. She didn't stop to acknowledge them, didn't look for approval. She just moved forward, as she always did. Inside the operations center, the mood was quiet. The commanders and officers gathered around the monitors, watching the final reports come in. The voices were subdued, the air heavy with the unspoken recognition of what had just happened. No one needed to say anything. Everyone knew. Sarah had just saved 3 lives. It was enough. She had done her job. Later that evening, when the base had returned to its usual hum, Sarah was called into the briefing room. She stepped inside, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor. The commander, standing at the front of the room, held a small box in his hands. He didn't speak immediately, just paused for a moment, allowing the room to fall into a quiet stillness. "Sergeant Reyes," he began, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held before. "You did something today that none of us had the courage to do. You made a decision when no one else would. You brought them home." The room was still, no applause, no raised voices, just the sound of his words hanging in the air. He opened the box, revealing a pair of pilot wings, silver, polished, gleaming in the overhead light. For too long, he continued, we allowed a different version of your story to stand. That ends today. He stepped forward, placing the wings into her hands. Sarah didn't flinch. She accepted them silently, her fingers brushing over the cold metal. She didn't need the ceremony. She didn't need the applause. She had done what was necessary. As the room remained silent, Sarah felt the shift. She hadn't expected this. No words of gratitude, no public recognition. It wasn't like the others who received medals or speeches. It was quieter, more meaningful, more real. The wings didn't change who she was or what she had done. They were just a symbol, and it was enough. The commander gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. You're dismissed, he said, and without another word, Sarah turned and walked out of the room. Outside, the air had grown colder, but there was a calmness in it now. As she made her way back to the hangar, she noticed the subtle changes around her. Pilots stepped aside when she passed. Mechanics nodded respectfully. The whispers she had overheard before had shifted. No longer were they dismissive, but filled with a new sense of respect. They weren't talking about her failure anymore. They were talking about her courage. Back in the hangar, Sarah returned to her usual spot. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't need to. She went through her usual checks, running diagnostics on the helicopters, making sure everything was ready for the next mission. But something had changed. The way people looked at her was different now. The conversations paused when she entered. No one laughed behind her back. No one ignored her. They had finally seen her for what she was, a skilled, capable pilot who had proven herself when it mattered the most. The next morning, Sarah arrived early, as always. The base was quieter, more subdued, but there was a sense of reverence in the air. The mechanics were already at work. The pilots gathered for a briefing. When Sarah walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers were gone. They didn't need to speak her name to acknowledge her anymore. She had earned something far more valuable than a medal or an award she had. Earned their respect. The commander walked up to her later in the day, holding another small object. It was a new patch, embroidered with a hawk in flight, wings outstretched. He didn't say anything at first, just handed it to her with a nod of approval. She took it silently, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. The gesture wasn't grand, but it was enough. You earned this, the commander said quietly, his tone still carrying the weight of his earlier words. Twice, Sarah didn't need to respond. She knew what he meant. The patch found a place on her flight jacket, another small symbol of everything she had fought for. It wasn't about the patch, though. It wasn't about the wings or the recognition. It was about how the base had changed. It was about how they had finally seen her. As the days passed, the respect continued to grow. The younger crew members started asking her questions. The older ones gave her nods of approval. The atmosphere around her was no longer filled with whispers or judgment. It was filled with recognition, silent, but undeniable. One evening, as Sarah stood beside Eagle 2, watching the mechanics finish their work for the night, the commander approached her once again. Thinking of going up again, he asked, his voice low. She glanced at him, then back at the aircraft. Always, she replied simply. He smiled slightly. I didn't think I'd see that day. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already proven herself. But the respect she had gained, the quiet recognition of her actions, was worth more than any medal, any words. It was the respect that came from within, earned not through ceremonies, but through action. As she walked away from the hangar, the familiar hum of the base surrounded her. The respect was there, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, real, and that was enough. The days that followed were quieter, but Sarah didn't change. She still arrived at the hangar before the sun rose, her boots echoing softly as she made her way to the helicopters. The work was the same, the checks and diagnostics just as meticulous as they had always been. But something had shifted in the base. It was subtle at first glances from her co-workers, a quiet nod from the mechanics as she passed, pilots stepping aside. There was no grand ceremony, no loud proclamations, just the quiet shift of respect. Sarah didn't need the recognition, but it was there, unmistakable. The usual banter had quieted. No more whispered jokes about her being just a technician. No more dismissive gestures when she walked through the hallways. People didn't avoid eye contact anymore. They saw her, not just as a technician, but as someone who had proven her worth in the harshest of circumstances. She hadn't asked for it. It had come to her through action, through a choice made in the heat of a storm. The respect wasn't loud, and Sarah never sought it. She didn't need the fanfare or the accolades. She had saved lives, and that was enough. Still, There were moments when she would catch a glance from one of the young mechanics, or hear a whisper from the pilots as they stood in the mess hall. She didn't turn to face them. She didn't need to. She knew what they were saying. Her name had changed from one of curiosity to one of respect. It was a quiet day when the commander approached her again. He was holding a small, folded envelope, and his face was unreadable. As usual, she looked up from the helicopter she was inspecting, her hands still working as if nothing had changed. The commander stood in front of her, and for the first time, there was a shift in his posture, something subtle, but there. He didn't speak at first, just handed her the envelope. Sarah paused, her fingers brushing over the surface. It was a formal notice, the kind she had seen before. She opened it slowly, the crisp paper unfolding. The words were clear and to the point. Sergeant Sarah Reyes, flight status reinstated. Status cleared for active duty. There was no fanfare, no applause. No one gathered around to cheer her return. But as Sarah read the words, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't about the reinstatement. It wasn't about the flight status or the wings pinned to her chest. It was about the silent acknowledgement, the recognition that had come not from a ceremony, but from the respect of her peers. She folded the letter neatly, slipping it into her pocket without a word. She didn't need to thank the commander. He didn't expect it. The weight of his quiet nod was enough. In the following weeks, Sarah returned to flying. Her first official flight after her reinstatement was a routine supply run. Nothing too complex, but the pilots, the crew, everyone noticed. They watched her as she climbed into the cockpit, no longer with suspicion or judgment, but with a sense of acknowledgement. The younger pilots, who had once whispered about her, now watched closely as she performed the pre-flight checks with precision. They asked questions, eager to learn. Sarah never offered much in the way of answers. She didn't need to. She let her actions speak for her, just as they always had. The respect wasn't just in the words that were said. It was in the way they acted when she walked into a room. No longer was she the technician who only existed when something broke. Now, she was part of something bigger. Her flight was smooth, her route uneventful. But when she landed, the co-pilot, a young man still new to the base, glanced at her. "You're the one they're all talking about, aren't you?" he asked, his voice tentative. Sarah glanced at him, then back at the horizon. "What did they say?" she replied softly, not looking at him. That you warned them," the co-pilot said. "That you saved them all." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the distance. "Sometimes people need someone to blame," she said quietly. "Sometimes people need time to understand what they missed." The co-pilot was silent for a moment, his eyes following her gaze. "It's not fair," he said quietly. Sarah let out a slow breath. "It wasn't," she said, "but I'm still here." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The co-pilot was still young, still figuring out how this world worked, how the rules were sometimes written in black and white but were often understood only in the gray. Back at the base, things had changed. The chatter in the mess hall was different now, too. The young medic spoke of the storm, of how the sky had seemed to split open when Eagle 2 appeared through the clouds, how the rotor wash had cleared a path for them. One of the soldiers who had been rescued had even said something just before. "They were loaded onto the stretcher. We were saved the moment we saw the bird." Sarah didn't hear any of it. She was back in the hangar, alone as usual, polishing the tools and preparing the equipment for the next flight. She hadn't asked for the attention, hadn't wanted the recognition, but it had come to her, in its quiet, steadfast way. Days passed, and Sarah continued to do her job as she always had. But now, the younger mechanics asked her questions. They didn't laugh at her anymore. The older ones, too, nodded when she passed. The respect had shifted, not through grand gestures, but through the understanding that she had earned her place in the sky. And so, life at the base continued, calm and steady. The storm had passed, both outside and within. But for Sarah, it had always been about the quiet victories, the ones that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops, the ones that only mattered to those who understood. Later, a small photograph was added to the wall in the hangar. It was of Sarah, in her flight suit, standing among the crew after the rescue. Below it, a small plaque read Flight Sergeant Sarah Reyes, cleared for duty, courage and silence. It was a simple tribute, understated and unassuming. But to Sarah, it meant everything.